Okay, so by the time I actually post this video, most of you will probably have already cancelled your Shudder subscriptions and put your pumpkins in the compost, but it's Halloween for me, so I'm doing a Halloween video. I thought it would be fun to just randomly pick some horror stories and read and review them. I've amassed a fair amount of horror anthologies and short story collections now, which I'm quite into the idea of just dipping into them, rather than systematically reading them all cover to cover. It's quite fun to do a video entirely focused on horror. I'm going to cast quite a broad net, include dark fantasy, anything remotely unsettling. I mean, the boundaries of horror are possibly even more vague than those of the science fiction genre. I've put the names of all the horror collections I have in one of those random picker apps, and then use like a random number to pick the story within the collection. It will be obvious to you as soon as it cuts to the first review that my beard magically gets quite a lot longer. I am recording this last thing just because that's how it happened, really. But it's quite nice to know what's coming in this intro. So yeah, I end up dipping into 5 different collections and reviewing 7 stories across them. And, random picking was the original aim. I don't quite keep to that. I wasn't that concerned with chasing true randomness as I was with enabling the possibility of encountering stories I wouldn't have otherwise picked, But yeah, you'll see. But yeah, that's it. That's what's happening. So let's move on to story number 1. I put these shelves up recently, and I've now got my whole short story collection on these 2 shelves, and the top right up there. So I've put everything that's vaguely horror, most of it's on this shelf, into one of those random picker apps. And yeah, let's just see what comes out. I've included dark fantasy like Gene Wolfe's collections here. Yeah, anything which could be vaguely unsettling, that's gone in the pool. So if something comes up and you're like, well, that's not really horror, that's why I've cast a very wide net. All right, let's see what we get. Hell yes. We've got Ligotti. I'm extremely happy about that. Where is that? Here, Teatro Grotesco. I've read a few in this collection already, and I feel like Ligotti is very rapidly becoming one of my favorite writers. It's like an evil Borges. It's just brilliant. So now I'm going to use a random number generator to randomly pick one of these stories. And I know a lot of these collections, particularly single author collections from the 80s onwards, they tend to be more likely to have a thematic link and recurring motifs, and there is definitely an advantage to reading some of them as a whole book. But I'm just not going to worry about that because it's too much to think about. Each story is still worth reading in isolation, so I'm just going to go forward with that for now. All right, let's see what we get. I don't know if you can see this very well, but we got 13 stories, so I'm just going to choose a random number between 1 and 13. This is one of those generators that's using atmospheric noise to get true randomness, so this will be truly random. We got number 5. Cool. Number 5. So that is The Red Tower, which I've already read, but I am very happy to read it again and talk about it. So yeah, The Red Tower coming up. All right, back in the woods. It's feeling very autumnal in the woods right now. Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? So The Red Tower by Thomas Ligotti. Man, I love Thomas Ligotti. I mean, I've only read like 6 stories of his so far. I discovered him like relatively recently. I'm new to weird fiction in general, or at least new to getting into it, you know. And anyone with a passing interest in weird fiction has been pointed towards Thomas Ligotti at some point, for good reason. He's great. He's one of those authors as well that he preferred reading and writing short fiction rather than novels. So, you know, he's very welcome on this channel for obvious reasons. The Red Tower is great. I really like it. So I read this several months ago now, I think. And I really enjoyed it then, in that kind of, what did I just read kind of way, you know, like it's so abstracted. It's almost like an experiment in writing a story without any character or plot. That can turn people off, for sure. And yeah, I wouldn't blame anyone for not enjoying this story for that reason. But I love it. I think it's great. I think the first time I read it, I had the feeling that this is obviously an allegory for something. It's a metaphor, clearly, especially considering the ending. But it's on the second read that it started making more sense to me, actually. And yeah, again, another story I've read for a second time that makes way more sense. Short stories like this are meant for rereading. So I'm just going to say now that the only way I can think to discuss this is to just burn the story down. So if you want to read it beforehand, it's only a few pages long. I'll put the link for the story in the description for this video. So you can go away and read it right now if you want to. It won't take long. And then come back and watch the review. So yeah, what is the story about? It's a narrator describing this weird ruined factory in the middle of a bland, desolate landscape. So it's got that kind of, you know, weird architecture thing going on that you often get in weird fiction. The obsession with weird old houses, but it's got that abstractness to it as well. It's just in the middle of this bleak landscape. There's nothing else around. The outside world is referred to in snippets later on, but like it's almost like it doesn't really exist, you know? I mean, the narrator must exist in this outside world, but it's not clear where that is, you know? So all we're being told about is this ruined factory, otherwise known as the Red Tower, in this bleak landscape. And that weird architecture in a kind of abstract setting, Thomas Disch talks about that in his introduction to Strangeness. He gives the example of Edgar Allan Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher. So Roderick Usher is painting these bizarre scenes that take place deep underground. Pours a little light on the detail of why you know they're deep underground. He just says there's some decoration that implies they're very deep underground. But it's just like a long corridor with no doors, no ways in or out. And yeah, that's creepy, right? It works really well. When this kind of weird architecture is abstracted in some way, it's in an impossible place. It feels impossible, but also familiar at the same time. It really like triggers that sense of eeriness, you know. So that's going on here with the Red Tower. He says there's no doors to it on the outside, but actually it turns out there are subterranean tunnels, as he describes later on. He says the machinery in the tower was making these novelty items, which is very funny. I really like Thomas Ligotti's humour. It's so like darkly absurdist, you know. These novelty items are getting transported out through these subterranean tunnels, and they're making stuff like, I'm not sure how much the details of these items really matters, but like a pocket watch that's way too, was it a cameo? Cameos that are like way too heavy for what they should be. And lockets that open up to reveal like a roaring, echoing abyss. And yeah, I quite like those kind of details. They almost feel like quite random. And then he talks about how the tower is in conflict with the landscape around it. The bleak, perfectly unchanging, static landscape, this grey land that surrounds the tower, is trying to destroy the tower somehow. The machinery at some point evaporates and just leaves these ghostly impressions seen in moonlight. But then production carries on in the factory or the tower, but it moves underground. And he talks about these weird hyperorganisms. Again, really funny to him. And Ligotti is extremely vague on the detail of these organisms, but you can quite easily imagine something really horrible. There's a really cool artist impression of it posted with the online version of the story on that Weird Fiction website, which you can go look at. But yeah, there's like graves with tombstones with no names on it and no dates, and these graves, which Ligotti says they're not burying graves. Again, like, I was just laughing reading this. They're not what you'd call burying graves. They're producing these weird hyperorganisms, and that gets annihilated by the landscape again. And there's no character. There's no people referred to, you know, other than the delirious witnesses that have told the narrator about the Red Tower. And the narrator's constantly saying he's envisioning all of this. So it's clearly we're in unreliable narrator territory, unreliable witnesses. All the evidence is spurious, sketchy in some way. But yeah, after this second stage of production gets shut down, there are rumors of production continuing on a third underground level. And the ending is key here, where he says, everyone's talking about it. Everyone's talking about the Red Tower in some way or another. In one way or another, all they're talking about is the Red Tower, which is like, yeah, okay, this is an allegory for what? Like, everything? If all anyone's talking about is the Red Tower or the landscape around it, it's clearly like a metaphor for, I don't know, like, at first I thought, oh, is it like a metaphysical thing? The language around the tower is constantly talking about degeneracy and decay, but at the same time, evolution, and lots of the descriptions are very organic. Like the materials used in the tower are, yeah, they're steel and concrete and brick, but they're also bone and stuff that sounds like sinew. There's a weird confusion of decay and creation in the concept of the Red Tower, right? And even the fact that it has two names seem to kind of reflect this duality, like the ruined factory and the Red Tower. Although the ruined factory kind of contains that duality within itself, right? So it's got that kind of duality inherent to the Red Tower, but then it's also opposed to this bleak, unchanging landscape, right? So for a while, because my head was already there, I was thinking about, you know, oh, is he doing that thing I was saying might be interesting about entropy, you know, like where talking about the duality of entropy and creation, almost the contradiction or the conflict of that, which leads to all this stuff. But everything about the Red Tower is horrible, right? It's disgusting and almost random in its creations, and everything seems purposeless. So there is the possibility that this is a metaphysical allegory, or it works as that alongside something else, which I'll get to in a minute. And it's, I guess, like a kind of Schopenhauer sort of thing. I'm not a philosopher. Like most things, I don't know what I'm talking about. So, you know, just take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But, you know, he had that thing with the will, the kind of metaphysical idea of will behind everything being evil or bad in some way. It's like extremely pessimistic. And I know Ligotti is pessimistic in his philosophy, so I guess I could see that working. But then I started to think, there was, I was reading about Ligotti to get a bit of background, and I saw, he said he struggled with anhedonia for a really long time, which is the inability to take pleasure in things. It also affects motivation and concentration. It's something I have a huge amount of sympathy for, because I've been struggling with it for the past couple of years, and I almost didn't know how bad it was until I got put on something that helped it. I was like, oh shit, this is what it feels like to be human. It was bizarre, that kind of change. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. It's awful. It's the closest thing I can imagine to the feeling of not having a soul, you know? That's what it feels like. I know Ligotti was struggling with that for a really long time. And he says in this story, where is it? He's talking about how the factory used to be pale before it became red. As far as we can tell, he's just decided this, you know? It's intuition, I guess. And he says, thus the encrimsoning, great word, of the factory was a betrayal, a breaking off, for it is my postulation that this ancient structure was in long forgotten days the same pale hue as the world which encompassed it. Furthermore, with an insight born of dispassion to the point of total despair, I envisioned that the Red Tower was never solely devoted to the lowly functions of an ordinary factory. Dispassion to the point of total despair, that sounds like anhedonia. That's what that feels like. So immediately I'm thinking that the narrator is Ligotti. It's him. And this is a metaphor for his own psychology, I think. In horror and weird fiction, there's always this element of, why are people interested in the macabre and the strange, or the bizarre, all of that stuff, or even violence of various kinds, degeneracy and decay. I think it's present in all of us, clearly in some more than others, but almost immediately, like Gothic and then weird fiction, when dealing with this, because you can't just, it's gauche, right, to just display a load of weird stuff to the reader, be like, hey, look at this. I mean, some of that was true earlier. Poe was definitely doing a bit of that, but almost immediately in like Gothic fiction and then weird fiction, you've got this trope of the narrator or the character they meet who is obsessed with this stuff, this weird stuff, right? So there's a vicarity to it. You don't have to feel guilty about your own prurience because you're experiencing it through this fictional characters, right? It's their weird obsession. It's not yours. You're just reading it for a bit of fun. And that's like a huge trope in weird fiction and Gothic fiction, right? This story feels like it's about that, but it's cutting straight through that indirectness. It is Ligotti that has the weird obsession. And potentially the novelty items are his first stories, and the hyperorganisms maybe his more developed fiction, and the rumours maybe what is yet to come, if he writes anymore. And I feel like the blandness of the landscape it feels like it's his mental health, right? Whenever he's in a bad place, this stuff gushes forth, right? It has to be released. That's what it feels like with the Red Tower, is like this eruption in the mind as a result of an imbalance. Very likely due to the material conditions around him, but also just biology or psychology, Very possibly I've just gone off the rails here. But this is just what I was thinking when I was reading it, and it seemed to work well for me anyway. Very possibly I thought this because that's how I feel. I don't want to compare myself to Ligotti too much, like he's an amazing writer. I'm just like chatting bullshit to camera. It resonated, right? And that's what happens when you find a writer who you end up really loving, which I can tell Ligotti is going to be for me. When you read something and it's like, oh shit, this guy gets it. This is what I've been trying to express in some way, but I've been unable to. And to see it written down so well, it's like a revelation, a sense of relief, it's that feeling of like, there's someone else that feels that way. It's a big reason I read. I remember having that experience with Kafka as well, which there's a lot of here, of course, because like Edgar Allan Poe, anything dark and vaguely literary, you can point to Kafka and you're probably well within your rights to do so as an influence, but his influence is so wide, it's almost meaningless to say that, but I did feel that, especially in the kind of, it's very deliberate prose. I've seen people online describe it as overwrought. I think particularly because Ligotti tends to repeat himself a lot, but it's intentional, and I really like it. I feel like he's stressing the importance or the inescapability of certain elements within the story. Like this, he'll keep saying the same thing because it should keep coming to your mind, For some people who are not used to it, that can break the rhythm, and that's totally fine. This is all subjective at the end of the day, isn't it? Taste and everything. I could fully understand if this isn't someone's cup of tea, especially since there is no real plot or character, but I found it impressive that he could write an interesting story that didn't have plot or character. I feel like Borges goes down that route a lot, and it's something the short story is really good at, right? Because you can have an idea or a thought experiment, which is that's the fancy version of an idea story, isn't it? The thought experiment. That's what you get when you got someone literary doing it. Yeah, which is why I tend to think of Ligotti as a bit of an evil Borges, because he'll do this sort of really abstract thought experiment. It's clearly an allegory for some sort of politics or psychology, and it's great. It's something to chew on for the rest of the day, you know, or all week maybe. Like, I only really started understanding the story, I feel, after reading it a second time and reading about Ligotti. To me, it seems like a very personal story, and I think that context really opens it up, which is often the case, right? I think ultimately it's one of those stories you can never be certain about, you know, which I really love, particularly with art. I was saying before that in fiction, I really like to be given problems that can't be solved, or you can keep working at them and keep getting solutions. I think that's a better way of saying it, really. I don't necessarily feel that way about my job, you know, doing science. I like to have problems I can solve in that area. And you might think, well, it's a bit strange to not have that mentality with something like science fiction, which, you know, I'm a big fan of. This sort of thing is what draws me to weird fiction in particular, is way more common to get this sort of thing where it's not obvious. You can come up with multiple answers. You'll never know for sure if it fits perfectly. It's impossible to know for certain. But because of that, it keeps generating new thoughts, right? And it's way more productive, which is what reading is all about, right? It's just interesting. Is it interesting? Oh yeah, that was something as well. He talks about when these novelty items appear. They can appear anywhere. They go through these tunnels, and they can appear in people's closets or on their bedside table, or they've even appeared within people's bodies while they're alive, or the recently deceased, which maybe that's why they died, right? I don't know. It's probably the most unsettling part of the story. For the most part, I didn't find this unsettling. I found it really interesting. It's like, what is going on? You know, like, what is this about? But that bit was definitely unsettling. I feel like that fits with this psychology metaphor. It's almost like there's another element to it where it could be like repression. The pure grey landscape is trying to smooth away the red tower because of its degeneracy, its offensiveness. But every time something fades from the tower, Ligotti says the production gets more ambitious and goes underground, which feels like repression, right? It boils up, and I found that interesting. There's potentially something there, but I also really like the idea of the things the tower is producing being Ligotti's fiction. Yeah, there's so many ways to interpret this, which I love. It's almost the perfect short story for me, you know? And again, I understand if people would find it too cold and clinical because there's no character. I think you could argue that Ligotti is the character in the story, right? It's his mind. Or the Red Tower is the character. You know, it's imbued with its own agency. It's talked about how it changed its production, it excavated underground, and you know, you don't hear about any workers or anything. Like, it's the tower doing it. It's almost like the tower is an entity in and of itself, right? I think that's all I got to say about the Red Tower. Great story, highly recommend. Yeah, can't wait to read more Ligotti. I just know, like Borges, I haven't read that much, but what I've read, I've loved so much, and it's such a nice feeling when you find these authors. And Barry Malzberg's like this as well, where it's almost like you're quite happy to slowly work through their stuff, because it's just a nice feeling to know you've got like quite a large backlog of great stuff to read, you know? I'm going to drip feed the Malzberg books and the Ligotti and Borges stories over years, and I'm going to be having a great time with that. And you can reread all that stuff as well, particularly the short fiction, you know? So yeah, great start. Really happy with this. The weather is turning in the woods. I think it's going to rain. So I'm going to head back and let's see what's up next. Okay, let's spin this again. Ooh, Highsmith. Okay. Where is that here? Right. Okay, cool. So yeah, obviously Patricia Highsmith, more well known for her crime fiction, like the Ripley books, but turning her pen to the macabre. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that was bad. Well, no, it was fine. So Pope Sixtus the Sixth and the Red Slipper, as you may have been able to tell from the title, it's not a horror story. It's like a cute political story. I guess the most you could call it is like a curious tale, you know, like it's a very offhand story. Yeah, I don't know. Pope stubs his toe and I guess a really big blood blister, and during a speech, the pain of it convinces him to abandon his conservative politics and call for workers to demand better rights from their employers. I'm sympathetic to that, obviously. If you've watched any of my videos, I'm left-wing. I'm very left-wing. Yeah, as a piece of fiction, I don't really care. There are protests, police get violent, and yeah, Pope ends up getting killed on a coca plantation in Colombia. Who cares, right? This isn't interesting, and I have like nothing to say about it other than it's kind of weird that Patricia Highsmith wrote this. This is actually the first thing by her I've read. I've been meaning to read Strangers on a Train and the Ripley books forever, and I know I'll enjoy them. I think that's why I never get around to them, but this isn't damaging her reputation in my mind. I feel that it's just something she knocked out, or she had these lying around or something. Tales of natural and unnatural catastrophes. Cool cover though. Like it's got one of those, I don't know, what do you call it? It's got a little cutout, a crucifix, and then that's an illustration for the first story, which I also read because I didn't want to visit this collection and not experience Highsmith doing weird fiction or horror or whatever. And that was also bad. It was a passable idea. It was like a really middle of the road science fiction story, something I wasn't pushing any boundaries that might have appeared in one of the big science fiction journals in the 60s or something, you know. So that was called The Mysterious Cemetery. Terrible title. Like, The Cemetery would be fine. The Mysterious Cemetery. Like, and this whole thing has that kind of cutesy tone that it's like it's written for kids. It feels like, I know Roald Dahl did some, like, I don't know, Curious Tales type thing. I can't remember what they're called. I haven't read them, but like I have read other Roald Dahl. You know, I was a child once in the UK, no less, in Cardiff. So you know, you really get blasted with the Roald Dahl around there. That's where he was from. Yeah, it reminded me of that kind of tone. You know, it's like a scientist in a hospital with a cemetery nearby. They're experimenting on tumors in cancer patients, giving them experimental carcinogenic drugs, and then watching the tumors grow. And then they're burying them in the cemetery when they're done with them, but the tumors continue to grow in the cemetery. And it becomes a bit of like a tourist attraction, but also a health hazard. Yeah, there was nothing spooky about it. It could have been spooky. Yeah, my impression is I'm going to stick to her crime, you know? I don't know, it's just a bizarre collection as well. From what I can tell, most of them are just kind of cutesy political stories calling for better workers' rights, better women's rights. Hey, that's what I want, but it's just the way it's written, you know? It's not interesting. So I probably won't be reading any more of this. Yeah, it's, I had a look online and a lot of people seem disappointed. No, everyone seems to agree, even if they like it, that it's not anywhere near her best. I do feel like this collection has been massively missold. Like, tales of natural and unnatural catastrophes. It feels like there's going to be at least some kind of horror in there. And there is that one story at the beginning about the cemetery, but it's not written like horror. It's written like very conventional science fiction. Put in a cover like that as well, like a spooky cemetery with the weird tumors coming out of the graves and everything. This screamed horror or weird fiction to me. So that's really disappointing. Also, on the back, the Sunday Times called it Greenpeace Gothic, which is an incredibly embarrassing phrase that should never be repeated. Yeah, and all the like reviews are like, oh yeah, really black stylist and macabre entertainment and perverse. It's not. It's very inoffensive, middle brow stuff. So yeah, I was hoodwinked. Most of the collections I got, I had some idea of them being good, you know, worth seeking out in some way. But this was a random charity shop find. So I'm blaming that. Yeah, so yeah, that's a bust. Let's not spend any more time on that. Let's spin the wheel again. Okay, let's do this again. Some actual horror, please. Oh, hell yeah. Robert Aickman, Dark Entries. Go to the Aickman section. All right. Brilliant. This is an Ex Libris edition. It's in really good nick. I feel like it must have barely been read before it was withdrawn. Where's this from? North Lincolnshire. How do people feel about Ex Libris? Like, I really don't mind, to be honest. I think this is nice. I'm terrible at keeping books in good condition, so probably good to have it shielded from me in some way. Back to the random number generator. We got 7 stories. Number 5. Okay, which is The View. All right, I'll get back to you with my thoughts on The View by Robert Aickman. Okay, Robert Aickman, The View is amazing. It's so good. That's how you write a modern fairy tale. I kept thinking while I was reading it of that Graham Greene story I reviewed in Dish and Naylor's anthology Strangeness, which like almost did it for me, but not quite. And that was about a man who felt like he'd lost touch with his imagination and was rediscovering that side to himself by writing out this story of this memory he had of potentially crossing into fairy and having weird interactions with strange and vaguely supernatural people. I found it interesting, but like it didn't quite do it for me, to the point where I was wondering if I'm just not into fairy stuff, you know? Even though I know that's not true, because I enjoyed Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, Susanna Clarke's book. But this was a masterclass in how to write that kind of story. You could also interpret it as a ghost story as well. I think that was Aickman's thing. I think he was particularly interested in the subgenre of the ghost story, and he developed it into something more. His Strange Tales, you know, where often his stories have figures in them which you don't know whether they're a ghost or not. And that makes them more interesting, right? Rather than just, it's, oh yeah, it's a ghost. You know what a ghost is. Like, you know the rules and that sort of thing. Like when something becomes too established like that, it loses its weirdness and its horror, I guess. Like the vampire is a bit like that now. It's almost been like clinically rehabilitated through overuse. When it feels freshest is when it's not quite the same thing that you recognize, you know? It's kind of like a vampire, but the rules aren't the same, and that kind of reinfuses the weirdness into that element, you know? So yeah, I think Aickman's doing that with the ghost story. I know he really bigs up Elizabeth Bowen's ghost stories, so I'm quite interested in checking her out. She's like a literary author from the 19th century, most well known for her purely literary work. But yeah, The View, immediately I knew I was in for a good time. It starts out with this guy on a boat. He's convalescing from some illness that is never fully explained. It's talked about in such a vague way throughout the story that you're not even sure if it's a physical or a mental illness. It could even just be a figurative one, like a spiritual malaise. In fact, that's kind of implied that he is ill because he lost touch with his imagination and he spent too much time. The phrase living among strangers is constantly used, which I think is a reference to modernity, which is something that Aickman hated. He was a very reactionary, potentially elitist figure, almost like some similarities to like Tolkien in a way, harking after this lost time. But whereas Tolkien liked to fantasize about this lost pastoral England, and Aickman had that to a certain extent as well, but Aickman seemed to be quite fixated on the pre-World War I era of England, particularly like Edwardian times, and he felt like Britain had lost its way since then. I do find it interesting when, I mean, like, I used to really like Tolkien. I'm not as interested in him now. But he did, in a very real sense, invent a large chunk of modern fantasy. And I do find it interesting when you get these reactionary figures that are obsessed at looking at the past and end up inventing something which everyone considers new, like the strange stories of Aickman. People talk about Aickman-esque stories. It feels like Aickman invented a new subgenre of weird fiction. I think what Aickman's doing is more interesting than Tolkien. Tolkien was interested in inventing a mythology, literally mythologizing England. Whereas, while Aickman does revel in certain aesthetics of the past, particularly among like the upper classes, I think Aickman was quite aspiring upper class, He was really into opera and theatre, was always trying to get on committees to do with that stuff. And he started up the Inland Waterways Association, which aimed to conserve the canal network in England, and like played a huge part in restoring the canals and keeping them intact. His book Know Your Waterways, that's for the Aickman completionists. It sounds like his non-fiction books are also quite weird. His biographies. There's a good documentary about his life on YouTube I recommend watching. Yeah, interesting guy. So yeah, he's using some of the aesthetics of the past, but I think he's more reacting against like scientistic or positivist attitudes towards reality, I guess. The idea that everything can be explained through a scientific rationale and understanding. That's possibly part of the reason I really like him, is I feel like I'm reacting against that as well. It feels like it's so prevalent to the point of impairing other ways of thinking about the world. The scientistic seems to focus on the external world, right? But not so much on the internal one. Even psychology, which could be interpreted as science analyzing some element of our internal experience, really comes about through the external study of other individuals. The scientist is the observer compared to the subject. So even in that sense, everything's still externalized. But within the experience of the human mind, not everything is logical and rational. Increasingly, as time goes on, I find that like a deeper well to draw from in terms of enjoying fiction anyway. Like I was saying with Ligotti, problems that can give you multiple solutions. And Aickman seems to be perfect for that. I've only read a few stories in Cold Hand in Mine, one of his later collections, and this one, The View in Dark Entries, but I've loved pretty much every one. Again, like Ligotti is one of those authors that I'm just so excited to read all of his stuff and almost intentionally taking my time with it. Borges as well, like all these like big short story writers, the ones that focus on the short story and write these very like strange, dense fictions that you can dwell on for a long time. As part of the reason I don't want to binge Aickman as well is I get to the end of the story and I feel like I need a week to think about it. I don't want to jump straight into the next one because then I'll forget too quickly what was going on in the one before. But yeah, so this character, Carfax, is leaving England on a ferry, setting out from Liverpool, and the descriptions of Merseyside enveloped in mist at the beginning while Carfax is standing on this boat. It's raining and he's everyone's gone inside, so he's just alone standing on the deck watching the stone birds on the Liver building disappear into the fog, and it's just so atmospheric. It just drew me straight in. I know quite often I need to have like some sort of like confidence instilled that I'm going to enjoy this story, and then I can kind of relax into it. And I was just given that immediately. And Aickman writes with these quite long sentences. His descriptive writing will be quite like long and elegant and usually tie back to the mentality of the main character in some way. It does for Carfax. Let's see if I can find one, actually. The glass through which he glimpsed life as he sailed that morning imparted this rainbow watery transient clarity of colour while compressing and encircling with a boundless edge of uncertainty. It's pretty cool, right? And pretty much every sentence is like that, which, I can understand if some people find that overly dense. That's just like a taste thing. but I quite like it, and I just feel like there's something interesting to think about with pretty much every sentence. There's no filler, you know. This whole bit is amazing. Through that unexpected consortium of rain, fog, and wind, which is the characteristic climate of Merseyside, Carfax watched the 15-foot liver birds on top of the great building recede into the driving cloud, which is their element. Mythical, yet, in the case of at least one specimen to be stuffed in a Liverpool public building, these creatures ride the seldom abating storm like human hopes. He remembered that 15 years ago he had hastened third class to Liverpool in pursuit of a beautiful vaudeville actress, then appearing in that city at the Shakespeare. Passion, he seemed to recall, was then something unable to be left with his cheap synthetic suitcase in the station cloakroom. The boat was beginning to roll to an extent which many of his neighbours seemed to think disagreeable, and Carfax wondered whether unhappiness or nausea tended the faster to produce the other. This next bit is all one sentence. By the time they were nearing the Barlight, terminus of the long double series of buoys which leads vessels from Liverpool towards the fathomless submarine canyon lying concealed north and south down the middle of the Irish Sea, Carfax had discovered the bow of the boat to be uninhabitably gale-swept and also lacking in seats. Astern he found the best place which offered, and, sinking into his overcoat, watched the crew as the light ship was passed heave overboard the fish on the end of a line which, turning in the water, records on a dial the distance travelled. Fully going on a journey for a third of a page with that one. Like, people talk about getting swept up in prose and that sort of thing, which is maybe a bit hackneyed to say, but I definitely felt like that. And he has these snippets of conversation that are going on around him. Like, she has no idea how plain she is, and of course you can't tell her, observed a conspicuously unattractive woman of about 45 to a replica of herself. Communism gives the workers something to work for, vehemently asserted a man in a raincoat. His wispy, colourless hair appeared on his prematurely obtruding scalp line, like the last vegetation in the Dust Bowl. That bit really reminded me of M. John Harrison. That was something he liked to do, go to cafes and incorporate the conversations that were going on around him into the stories he was writing. Pretty sure Aickman is an influence on M. John Harrison as well, particularly on the stuff he was writing in like Things That Never Happen. So yeah, Carfax is on this boat, heading out for a holiday for the sake of his health, according to his doctor, and he meets a woman on board. She's a mysterious woman, the classic trope of the weird tale. It definitely comes up a lot with M. John Harrison. I think Aickman does it a lot as well. Although, to be fair, the mysterious woman is done in a very interesting way in this story. Is she a woman? Is she a man? She may not even be human. She approaches Aickman. Just imagining the main character is Aickman. She approaches Carfax while he's, I think he's thinking of a quote of Sappho, and she approaches him on the deck and almost immediately goes back inside. She says something like, "Oh, you'll remember me, right?" And then says she's hungry, goes inside to the cafe. Carfax just follows her in, and then they sit down and have a quite stilted and awkward conversation, which, again, I love. That's something I really like. He mentions he's ill, and she says, "Oh, that's no surprise. You've been living among strangers for years." Which, again, I really like that as like a term for modernity, because I don't necessarily think Aickman was using it in this way, but I liked thinking of that in terms of social atomization as a result of neoliberalism, right? An increasingly individualized society. Maybe this was what Aickman meant, but it's just gotten far worse now than when this was written. And she says, "You simply must come to Fleet," which is her estate. So this is where some of the old British aesthetic is coming into play. Yeah, they get to this island, which is only ever referred to as the island. I wonder if there's anything significant about that. I mean, are there any islands straight off from Liverpool? I mean, there's the Isle of Man, which is a Celtic island, so probably not important. So yeah, they're on the island. This driver turns up and takes them to this beautiful country manor. And yeah, again, there's lots of amazing ways that with the description, everything is so ambiguous with Aickman. You know, like it's nothing is solid, nothing is fully explained. Even like throwaway descriptions of like the lawns of the manor. Carfax is like, they reminded him of peacocks. Like, he could have easily just had peacocks there, you know, but he doesn't see peacocks. He's just like, they give me the impression of peacocks. She basically refuses to tell Carfax her name. She says it's boring. Her name is just the names of anyone else, you know, very kind of standard, and so doesn't tell him, and he calls her Ariel. I mean, I'm not cultured enough to get all of the references in this story. It's very packed in. It's probably got the most references to art and literature I've come across since I've read Camp Concentration, which will probably forever hold that title of most dense. But I did get that reference. Ariel is a character in Shakespeare's The Tempest. I may not have seen the play, but I did see Forbidden Planet, as every good science fiction fan will have. Yeah, so I know what's going on. Robbie the Robot, right? I always found it quite disturbing that that robot had my name. But something I didn't really know until Aickman spells it out in the story is that Ariel is somewhat ambiguous in terms of their gender. If you don't know, Ariel is the air spirit that is working for Prospero in The Tempest, who wants their freedom, and Prospero says he'll offer it in return for their faithful service. And Ariel is the one that produces the storm that brings the ship aground, you know, The Tempest. So a pretty important figure. Yeah, Aickman specifically brings up the gender ambiguity. Carfax brings it up while talking to Ariel later on in the story. And he also, near the beginning, talks about how Carfax thinks of everything that's good in terms of emancipation, which is a really interesting turn of phrase. And also interesting when thinking about the motivations of the character of Ariel in Shakespeare. Yeah, the allusions are coming thick and fast, and they're definitely worth looking into. You know, I didn't get most of them while reading this because I'm an idiot, but I haven't read all this stuff or seen all this stuff. I do quite like this element of genre fiction as it's almost like a cheat code, right? Like with a lot of the new wave science fiction where they really wear their influences on their sleeves, they'll usually tell you the name of the artist that has inspired some element of the story. And then you can go off and read their stuff or read that work that influenced it. All kinds of references mentioned here. I made a list, made a brief list. I don't think I got them all either. It's just when I could be bothered to write them down. Some of the artists or authors, poets, actors, like I mentioned, Sappho, Wagner, Voltaire, Sartre, Goethe, Beddoes. Is that how you say that? Is a poet, right? Greta Garbo, and the poem Dover Beach, which gets quoted. The last verse of that poem gets quoted near the end, which is beautiful and perfectly fits the story. There's actually a Blogspot article reviewing this story I found online that lists all of these influences and talks about their significance. So I'll put a link for that in the description of this video because it's worth checking out if you're interested in this story. And it's quite nice to have a bit of a cheat sheet, you know, if you're an idiot like me. Yeah, and then the house is weird. Obviously, the house is bizarre. Every room is different and there's mirrors set up everywhere, so you get weird reflections of yourself when you look in any direction, and also weird reflections of all the rooms as well. Carfax goes to his room, which he never sleeps in. It's a surprisingly normal room compared to all the other rooms in the house. He's like, okay, this is like a traditional, posh English room. He does spend time in the room, even though he never sleeps there. The rest of the story is really just him trying to do various artworks and get back in touch with his artist self. You know, he's been working for the Foreign Office, I think, and lost touch with his artistic side, even though he used to make jingles. He was a musician and a painter as well. And this is all kind of coming out while he's staying in the house and recovering, you know, from whatever his illness is, which again was done well. It can easily be done badly, I think, when it can just be a kind of cheap trick to say that a character's been ill and then never really refer to any details of it, when illness is usually very apparent, not always to other people. Lots of illnesses and disabilities are effectively invisible to others, but they're often consistently apparent to the ill person. I'm somewhat wary of that kind of, oh, they're ill, and then you never hear anything about how they're ill, It's just a way to put a character in an unusual frame of mind or situation. It can feel like a cheap trick to me sometimes, but this worked really well because it is vague, but it's intentionally vague, and it's tied into this potential allegory of needing to get away from modern society and escape, just to it's almost like this fantasy of just living somewhere nice and doing art, spending your time doing art. I mean, that is kind of my fantasy. I would love that, particularly as someone who's chronically ill. Work is very hard and getting increasingly so. I feel like it pushes you to the point where increasingly you just want to be doing stuff you enjoy, because so much of the other joy has been sucked out of your life, So yeah, that resonated with me for sure. Then we come to the whole point of the story. Carfax is very... the name Carfax as well, that means crossroads in Latin, I think. And it's the name of... Is it the name of a Shakespeare character? Let me check that cheat sheet. I should probably name that person since I'm using their material. Brendan Moody. Thank you, Brendan Moody. You've made a very nice resource here. I recommend people checking it out. Carfax. Oh, it's the name of Dracula's home. That's it. And Brendan saying he doubts that matters much. I'm not so sure. Considering the ambiguity of the character of Ariel, quite interesting thinking of them in terms of a Dracula character, or vampire, whatever. But yeah, it is. He starts painting the view from the manor, and he notices whenever he's in his room, the view out the window is different to the view he sees while he's on the terrace painting the countryside. When he's outside on the terrace, he sees these mountains, and inside the house, looking out the window, he sees moorland going down to the sea, the occasional little house in the distance. And as the days go by, he sees more and more houses appear in this view out the window. And immediately I was thinking, okay, he's crossed into fairy, that's what's going on here. But it's never so explicit. There's this guy he keeps seeing around as well, this big lad. He sees him early on walking around the corner of the house, and later he sees him in the distance at an almost impossible height. He's impossibly huge to be the size he is on the distant moors, which again can't help but think is a reference to the giants in Celtic mythology and that sort of thing. And that's clearly the significance of this being somewhat set on the Isle of Man. The view he sees from the window is the Isle of Man, slowly coming back. But yeah, lots of interesting ambiguity with the gender of Ariel. She comes to breakfast or dinner, I can't remember, dressed in a man's Elizabethan get-up, which is very cool. And Carfax is commenting on how fetching that is. It's like an empty suit of armor, and its figure is somewhat ambiguous in terms of sex as well. It's referenced a lot. I'm not quite sure what exactly the significance of that is, other than to suggest that Ariel is more than she appears. There is some commentary from Ariel on the duality of gender within all of us, which again, really cool, especially coming from a writer who I thought was, quite conservative. I felt like this was quite a cool story, interrogating certain aspects of gender as opposed to sex. But I don't know, like everything, I'm reading into it with what's going on in my mind. But I thought it was really interesting. He never sees her in a day. She goes off in a day, horse riding, almost every day. I didn't really understand the significance of that, other than she has to constantly be moving. There's a very clear theme in the story of constant change. The carpets of the house have this pattern that never repeats itself. And it's something that's very clearly very dear to the personal philosophy of Ariel, She's like, nothing ever repeats, nothing stays the same, nothing is ever constant. So I feel like Aickman is almost like analyzing his own reactionary love of the past. He knows it can never return. And even if he went back there, it would depart almost immediately because everything's changing. And that's something they're talking about with their relationship. Carfax falls deeply in love with Ariel, and she does seem to love him, but in quite in a lighter way, in a way which is less attached, basically. And she's very affectionate and very concerned for Carfax's well-being. Whenever he brings up the weirdness of the view, she looks at him like he's crazy, basically, and thinks he's kind of mad. Doesn't understand why he needs an explanation. He's desperate to know why this is happening, and Ariel seems to be like, you won't find any satisfaction in that explanation. Like, it won't help you. And that ends up kind of shifting to their relationship as well, where he's saying if she tells him everything he needs to know, he'd be perfectly happy there with her. And she's saying, even if you were for a moment perfectly happy, it would change, and then you wouldn't be anymore, because everything's constantly changing. And that just keeps coming up. Even the house itself is ambiguous in its architecture and its state of ruin. Carfax can't decide whether it's new or old, whether it's a pastiche of the old or anything like that. There's a crest above the door that's kind of worn off, which again, I don't know. I don't know what the significance of that is, but like, I love it. I love the vibe, you know, the feeling of significance in something which you can't quite grasp. It really adds that sense of mystery. I feel like he's killing it here. Carfax always sleeps in Ariel's room at night. They're clearly having a physical relationship. They do some art together. Ariel never wants to return to anything old. You know, she's always looking for the new thing. And I think she knows it's all going to come to an end. And you know that too, you know, as the reader. But Carfax is desperately trying to cling on to what he has here. It's almost like his desperation to be perfectly happy in that setting and to not lose it is causing him anxiety, you know, which stops his happiness from being perfect. But in the end, as the view outside this window gets more and more like the normal Isle of Man with lots of buildings, he wonders the whole time, like, how is this house so perfectly secluded? It's amazing. How have they done that? How have they found this perfect spot? But clearly it doesn't exist in the real world, you know. Spoilers ahead, by the way. I would recommend reading this story. It's very good. They end up going for a walk down to the beach and share this like perfect moment together. And then after that, he knows it's all over. You know, like, to be kind of trite, like all good things come to an end. That's basically it. When he wakes up in Ariel's room, he hears someone run outside the house and he chases them, but he can't find them. And then he realizes he's just on, you know, the actual Isle of Man, you know. It's very busy outside, actually. There's all these houses and all these people. Their house is a complete ruin behind him. And he heads back to England. And a kid gives up his seat for him on the bus. And he realizes he's an old man now. Aickman foreshadows that when Carfax picks up a book that he sees Ariel reading, and it's a German book of fairy tales. There are a few stories in there which he's like, I think he knows just enough German to kind of have a go at translating some of them. And one of them is about a man who was given an object that would allow him to speed up his life at various moments. And so this guy skips past all the, you know, less enjoyable moments of his life and ends up only living 3 months in total. And again, you can look at this story in multiple different ways. You can look at it in terms of the fairy tale it's trying to be, like that story. Carfax accidentally strolls into fairy and lives this perfect life of art and love, but because it's so perfect, he's used up all of his time there. You know, he lives there for 3 months and he comes out an old man and heads back alone and near the end of his life. There's also there's clearly the psychological side of someone trying to escape modernity into a fantasy of the past, and it's slipping through their grasp. I think that's such a good allegory for that. Yeah, I loved this story, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface with it personally. Someone could write a thesis on this for sure. It's so dense and full of allusions to art and culture. I think there are so many different ways you could look at the story, particularly when taking those references into account. And the philosophy as well. I didn't even talk about the philosophy. So there's some clear references to, I think, Kant's idea of the noumenon. Carfax is, at some point, he seems to be confusing his perception of the internal and external to the point where he almost loses his sense of identity and is thinking in purely the external, like the noumenon. I've said before, like, I'm interested in philosophy, but I don't understand it. I wish I did. I'm sure someone could explain this much better than I could, but that was cool. I thought that was cool. And the house is called Fleet, right? As because it moves quickly. So that's kind of a little clue for you. There's some stuff like that. Reminded me a bit of Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe likes to construct these like puzzles of literature, which like can go either way for me. And generally, when they're more ambiguous, at least from the reader's perspective, I enjoy it more. But sometimes when he's doing a little kind of wink of his eye thing, like he's being mischievous, or like, I don't really care about that. But again, it's a subjective taste thing. It's a really good one. For Lesson. That's a great story by Gene Wolfe. That is super ambiguous. It's like a workplace story. I love a good workplace story. There were some parallels between Wolfe and Aickman here in that way of writing this kind of fantasy. This is a form of fantasy, really. But I think maybe the major difference between them is I think Gene Wolfe generally does have a solid answer of what's going on underneath. He may be alluding to various things which make it more interesting than just figuring out the mystery, but I think he knows the answer, whereas I don't think Aickman does. I think he's purposefully removed elements that would allow a perfect answer to fit the story so that you can't just think of it in one way or another. You have to think of it in terms of the mythological as well as the psychological and the philosophical all together. That's the only way it can vaguely make any sense, and even then it'll never settle. For me, that's like the perfect short story. Yeah, really into Aickman. Each story I read does more and more. So yeah, in that sense, this story, like most Aickman stories, all of the ones I've read anyway, resist explication and instead encourages multiple theories and ways of thinking about it. I think also at the heart of the story is what it's like to try and make art or create art. Carfax is reflecting a lot on, he has this initial inspiration of how to paint the landscape that after he becomes distracted by the difference in the view between the outside and the inside of the house, specifically from his bedroom, he loses that inspiration, he loses his flow, and he can't quite catch it again. And Ariel's talking about it like, once you have that inspiration, you need to get it down straight away. And yeah, there's lots of like reflections on what it's like to try and get in the zone, I guess, and like be inspired creatively, which I found really interesting. And throughout the whole story, he's struggling and failing really to accomplish that inspired work. He ends up giving up on the painting and moving on to writing songs based on poetry. I think he never quite achieves what he wants to, which I guess like could be a commentary on how much easier it is to start something than finish it as an artist, but also, I don't know, that sort of self-criticism. Whenever he thinks about something he's done in the past, he increasingly thinks about it negatively and is just looking for the next thing. It's again relating to this ever-changing pattern, right? Constantly moving forward. You can't stay still in the past. I guess that's like the central concept of the story. But yeah, I don't know. Who knows? It is genuinely a mystery. So yeah, That was amazing. That was so good. I enjoyed that a lot. It was a bit longer than the others, which you can probably tell it's taken me longer to talk about it. It was a little more than 40 pages. But yeah, well worth your time. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, again, it's in Dark Entries. Yeah, which I highly recommend getting for that story alone. But I mean, from what I can see, it's not even the most popular story for people to talk about in this collection. So yeah, cool. I think I'm up for reading another one or two stories. We need to get one that's a bit more, horror-y. We need something with a bit of an edge now, don't we? Like, The Red Tower was arguably edgy, but quite abstract at the same time, to the point where it felt like a thought experiment almost, So yeah, let's see what we get next. All right, one last spin. Come on, something good. Dark Forces, cool. That is the Kirby Macaulay anthology. Bunch of familiar names. Okay, 23 stories in this one. We're reading number 16, which is The Stupid Joke by Edward Gorey, who I've never heard of. He's like the one person in this collection, or maybe two, that I haven't heard of. Okay, so I can review this quite quickly right now. Edward Gorey seems to have been an illustrator as well as a writer, and this story, The Stupid Joke, is actually a little comic strip about a kid who doesn't want to get out of bed, which is something I can relate to. His family fuss over him and they give him treats and toys and things, but he still doesn't get out of bed as a prank. And then when he does decide to get out of bed, the sheets and blankets hold him in, and then his bed spreads wings and flies off. It's a cute little children's horror story, really. It's like it's a cautionary tale. It's like what's that guy, Hilaire Belloc, is that his name? I would have enjoyed this as a kid. Yeah, it's nothing really to fuss over. Let's pick another number from this book and see what we get, because it looks like there's some good stuff in here. It's 23 stories, and we're looking at number 4 this time. You could say I'm bending the rules here, but hey, it's my video. I can do whatever hell I want. So, The Crest of 36 by Davis Grubb. I haven't actually heard of him either. Maybe there are quite a few I haven't heard of in here. Look, Joyce Carol Oates. She always turns up in these anthologies. Okay, so The Crest of 36, Davis Grubb. I just found this story in the book and just thought it was interesting that the Robert Aickman story after it is dog-eared. And I don't know, I always wonder about that. Is that how far the last owner got before they gave up reading, or is it because they really liked that story? I mean, it's Robert Aickman, so it's probably great. So yeah, I don't know. But anyway, we'll get on reading this. So The Crest of 36 by Davis Grubb, who is the guy that wrote Night of the Hunter, which does sound good. The film adaptation I'm particularly interested in checking out. It's meant to be like quite influential, I think. But yeah, I thought this was good. I thought it was a good story. It was another ghost / fairy tale. Obviously, that means I am forced at gunpoint to compare it to Robert Aickman's The View, which is incomparable. So yeah, that is a shame. But yeah, I did enjoy it. It's like, well, I mean, it's a lot more American. It's set in West Virginia. It's is that Appalachian? I'll just cut that out if I'm wrong. But I know nothing about America. Well, in terms of geography, anyway. Yeah, it's got that, like, it felt like reading a Western, Like, it's set in the 30s, so it's a bit too late for that. But, kind of country America, rural America. You know what I mean? That place. It's a small place, isn't it? Rural America. Could drive across it in an hour. I mean, I do have a soft spot for that sort of thing, to be fair. I mean, I love Westerns, so yeah, I'm into that tone. It's got that device, which I quite like, where It's very clear that the narrator is a character in the story straight away, but you're not sure who it is for a while, and it kind of becomes apparent later. The narrator is quite young, was like 17, 18 years old, and so it's written in this kind of immature tone, but the writing still comes across as being written well. What is the crest of 36? It's the high watermark. So there's a guy who's got this job working as the wharf master for this small town. He's like living on a houseboat basically, but he's afraid of the river. While you're getting introduced to the story, the narrator is quite like tangential, kind of going on these little asides about various things like catfish in the river and little histories of the place. It very quickly builds up a very real feeling world, which is always an impressive thing to do in a short story. Otherwise, I mean, the writing is fairly conventional. This guy's working as wharf master. He's scared of the river. He's married to this old bent woman who seems to make breakfast for him and the young guy staying with him, who is the narrator. So he's kind of observing everything from the sidelines, but does get pulled in to the narrative later on when it turns out, that's right, this is another mysterious woman. Sorry, I got interrupted by battery issues yet again. Where was I? Yeah, so mysterious woman again. This is a bit more of a typical mysterious woman. Everything about this story is a bit less subtle than the Aickman one, you know? She's also not what she seems, because in the day she's this kind of old crone, but in moonlight she transforms into the most beautiful woman you've ever seen, and she just really wants to have sex. The wharf master guy refuses to one evening, and so she sleeps with the narrator, the young guy. I don't really care about that. She understands everything about the river. It's mentioned a few times that she's told the wharf master, what is his name? I can't just keep calling him the wharf master. Darley Pogue. She's told Darley Pogue that in the next life he's going to be reborn as a catfish. That's maybe why he's afraid of the river. I don't know. Because he refuses to sleep with her, she decides to get her revenge on him by lying about how high the river's going to go, because everyone's worried about flooding that year. She says it's going to be like something ridiculous, like over 100 feet. And he freaks out and tries to find the highest point in town to try and weather it. What's her name? I can never remember names. Lol, river witch, goddess, woman, whatever. He becomes really paranoid that she's trying to kill him. He seals up his room, but the water comes up through the pipes into that room and fills it up and drowns him. I'm not spoiling anything. It was a good story. I liked it. It was well written. Yeah, it's not the best thing I've ever read. Oh yeah, everyone's like shocked at how Darley seems to know everything about the river, but really he's getting that information from this woman. That was something that was a bit like, I don't know, cringy, is the way she's described. This is actually the opening of the story. I don't know if she was black or white, maybe some of both, or maybe Indian. There was some around Glory, West Virginia, who said she was full Cherokee and descended from the wife of a chief who had broken loose from the March of Tears in the 1840s. Some said, not descended at all, that she was that very original woman grown incredibly old. Colonel Bruce theorized that she was the last of the Adena, that vanished civilization who built our great mound here in Glory back 1,000 years before Jesus. I mean, obviously, ancient civilization, weird fiction, Lovecraft uses that a lot, doesn't he? But, I don't know, the exoticization of a person of color, you know, that doesn't read so well anymore. Never should have. So there's a bit of that. That's a bit like, but you get that with Westerns, don't you? And, you know, it's fairly in character for this kid in the 30s to be thinking like that. A lot of people were racist, basically. I don't know. Feels like I'm nitpicking here. I thought it was good. I think I made it sound like it ended with quite a dour tone. It's still very lighthearted, and it basically implies that they both turn to fish at the end. And they're having a great old time in, what river is it? The Ohio River. Okay, cool. But yeah, it's good. Combines the Western vibe with a kind of ghost story, fairy tale vibe, which, yeah, I can enjoy that. And I did. So yeah, nice to read a story in Dark Forces. I'll be coming back to this for sure. I quite like these big horror anthologies as an object you can keep returning to, you know. I'm not tempted to read them sequentially over 500 pages, you know, but yeah, just keep coming back and reading a random story. So yeah, this is the Dark Forces anthology edited by Kirby McCauley. He's a weird guy. Okay, I thought I would just pick the last story to read and review to try and get something that is maybe, I don't know, just got maybe a bit more edge to it and is somewhat closer to the platonic ideal of the horror story. I don't know. Since we've had a couple of the ghost/fairy tale story, you know, and that Patricia Highsmith collection, which is, I don't know what that was, just a bizarrely marketed collection of curious tales, I guess. So I thought I'd choose something from the New Terrors omnibus. That's the cover there. It's a huge anthology of some really good authors. It's edited by Ramsey Campbell, who, you know, he's a big horror guy, knows what he's doing. I don't think I've read any Ramsey Campbell yet. I've got a couple of his books lying around. I need to get to him. But I didn't choose the Ramsey Campbell story in this. I went for the Tanith Lee story because I love Tanith Lee. I've read a couple of books by her now, both of which I was really impressed with. One was Nightmaster. It's like a series of linked short stories, really, which sort of comprised a fictional mythology of these demons who are just messing with humanity. It was great. It was really good. And I read one of her sword and sorcery books, Shadowfire, which I thought was brilliant. One of the best examples of sword and sorcery I've read. She's great. She often deals with like quite dark psychological themes and isn't afraid to go to quite weird and dark places, particularly like when it comes to the erotic. And I mentioned it briefly before in my first video about how she went out of fashion with publishers because of how potentially problematic a lot of her books are, which I think is a real shame. I think she was an amazing writer. But despite, you know, not being able to get published in her late career, she still has just a crazy number of books out there. And I'm constantly coming across ones I've never heard of before. Like I was saying with Joyce Carol Oates, one of those authors who are so prolific that, you know, undoubtedly she's going to be maybe a bit inconsistent, but when she hits hard, you know. She generally writes dark fantasy, and like dark fantasy to horror, is there much of a difference? Like there's definitely a spectrum there, right? I remember reading an essay by Lisa Tuttle, which was tearing into the idea of how women authors writing horror are often labeled as dark fantasy authors instead, because women don't write horror, you know, they write dark fantasy and men write horror. So there's definitely like that sort of thing going on, at least in the 80s. I don't think that's as much of a thing these days. Yeah, I think Tanith Lee definitely falls into that bracket. I think she wrote a lot of horror, but wasn't necessarily labeled as such. But I was interested in checking out a story that was labeled as horror from back in the day. What day was this? I've been a bit lazy in this video. I haven't said the years or all the collections stories have been collected in. Yeah, let me know if you want that, by the way. I was just trying that out in the last video. It's a bit of work, but I think it's potentially interesting. I don't know. Yeah, let me know. Every story was first published in 1980, which was when this was published. So New Terrors 1 and New Terrors 2 were both published in 1980, and then this edition was printed in 1985. But all the stories are from 1980, which is a really interesting time. I feel like the vast majority of the genre fiction I read is published between 1965 and 1985. So this is at the upper end of that. That's not a rule I make for myself or anything, but I just gravitate there. I just really like that time period. So Tanith Lee's story in New Terrors is Room with a V. For those of you who did GCSE French like I did, will probably spot the pun there. It's about a room that's got a life of its own. Yeah, that's cool. That's a very classic horror trope, isn't it? You got the haunted house, that's a bit more popular. I'm a bigger fan of The Haunted Room, to be honest. There's something about it that gets to me just a little bit more. I can't quite put my finger on it. I think it's a little bit more claustrophobic than an entire house being haunted, right? Yeah, Tanith Lee doesn't disappoint. This may be the worst thing I've read by Tanith Lee, but it's still great, you know? Like, she's just brilliant. It's about a woman she's separating from her partner. They usually go on holiday to the seaside and get a room in this hostel or hotel. She's doing it alone this year, and her normal room isn't available, so she ends up in the last room they have, and there's a reason for that. Apparently the few occupants before her have all left it early, but very suitably vague descriptions of what's going on there. Yeah, the story is interesting psychologically. It's about this woman coming to terms with her own loneliness in the face of her failing relationship with this guy, David. She's having a weird time. She's sitting by herself on a bench on the seafront quite a lot, and it doesn't sound that nice. There are like gangs of kids running around, like putting her on edge. You get a sense of her insecurity. And when she tries to sleep in the room, which has this like milky smell, like this vaguely buttery, dairy smell to it, which that's another thing that gets me, right? Whenever there's a weird smell, that freaks me out. That was used really well in, what was it, Jeff Vandermeers, the second book in Vandermeers' Southern Reach trilogy, Authority, which I think I prefer to Annihilation, actually, just because I really love a weird workplace story with horror elements. That's a big element of that book. There's this weird smell around the office, and they keep saying, they're using some weird cleaning chemical, and that's why it smells like that. But it's just always there and always putting the guy on edge. I did like that here. There was a man, Mr. Tinker, who always used to rent out the room. The room has a history, and he considered it his room. He used to live with his sister, I think, and her husband for like 2/3 of the year. But they would pay for him to stay in this room for like 4 months to get rid of him, basically. But he said he would always be happiest there, according to, the owner of the hostel. The way she talks about Mr. Tinker talking about the room, you feel like there's a weirdly strong relationship between Mr. Tinker and the room. Very good setup. Whenever Caroline tries to sleep, she feels like the room is breathing around her. And the title of the story is like scored into the wall. Always a good horror element. Have some like hastily sketched graffiti somewhere. And the room seems to stop its breathing whenever she turns the light on. She's ruminating a lot on her relationships and her childhood. Being in the room reminds her of her aunt, who couldn't have children and sort of smothered her as a result, and was overly protective, wouldn't let her play with friends, just wanted to keep her to herself. And she seems to have a small trauma from being coddled by this woman who's like this great big woman. And yes, we're in the prime fat-hating period. The story does have that element, which isn't great, but it's not the worst. But while she's feeling claustrophobic in the room and trying to sleep, she's almost imagining that she's getting hugged by her aunt again, like being smothered by her aunt, and starts to think of the room as if it was her womb. Really, really cool. And weird. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, there's not a lot to talk about, to be honest. I really liked the vibe. I really liked the psychology, the anxiousness, the anxiety suffusing the story. I think Tanith Lee is great at that. This idea of the room being a womb begins to consume Caroline. And at night, when she's half asleep, she's having these delirious thoughts of like, when am I going to be born? Those parts of the story were particularly strong. The ending isn't what I expected. If you don't want it to be spoiled, I mean, it's not a big deal. Go and read it and then come back. Yeah, so the room is alive. very literally, well, kind of half in and out. Eventually, in one of these like delirious moments, she puts her hand on the wall and she feels that it's skin, and she freaks out basically. Or maybe not so much freaks out, but like she wants to escape. It's part of her, like, reflective of her general psychology, I guess. It's a metaphor. Of course it's a metaphor. She grabs her knife and plunges it into the wall, and like horrible, like thick, sticky liquid starts coming out. It's all in the dark, she can't quite tell what's going on. And she just keeps stabbing the wall, and eventually it stops pulsing and breathing. And in the morning, she kind of wakes up in the chair, and you're wondering if it was all a dream or whatever. But then there is this like horrible black substance over everything, which she washes in the shared bathroom. There's this shared bathroom situation with the family down the hall. I really like the whole kind of uncomfortable British holiday aspect of it, particularly like a 70s British holiday, having to share space with other families and, it just being a bit naff. I really like stories like that. There's a Brian Evanson story in that vein called A Seaside Town, which is excellent and probably the best example of that kind of weird holiday vibe you can get. I mean, that's set in France, but it's the same kind of thing. Staying in a weird hotel, furtively trying to observe your neighbors, and yeah, that's very good. But yeah, she washes the rug and just kind of goes out, and she's still kind of dealing with all this stuff. She's like wondering whether she needs to call David, wondering whether she's pregnant, which again, like, thinking about that Joyce Carol Oates story, Bodies, the paranoia of being pregnant. I can see that being such a source of horror, right? And obviously something only a woman can uniquely be able to write about. When she comes back, there's a whole commotion. There are police, and she says she's staying in this room, and the police are like, "Oh, you should probably see this then," and take her through. And she goes and looks at the room, and it's like phasing between a damaged normal room and something organic and putrefying. And then she makes a kind of glib comment and it ends. But I quite liked that. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, because, I mean, I'm going to sound like a hypocrite now, because I was praising the Ligotti and the Aickman story for being, ambiguous and resisting explication. But I think there's still a bit of that here. But I quite like that the way the story was written. I think it would have felt like a natural ending for it to be uncertain at the end, whether it was just in her mind or the room was alive, So that would have made sense in a horror story for that to be the case. And so you're not sure whether it's just her psychology or it's a reality or whatever. Instead, Tanithly makes the organic nature of the room visible at the end to everyone, after it's died anyway, and not just the woman. You could interpret that as it being, oh, it was alive. The room just was alive, and that takes precedent over the psychology. But I'm not so sure. I think the fact that the room is like phasing in and out, and everyone is seeing that, changing between being alive and just being a normal room. I think Tanithly is almost putting that, like, the duality of the story on display at the end of the story. It's almost representative of that duality of the story, right? The psychology versus the monstrousness, the weird element. And so I quite like thinking of it in that way. I don't know, maybe I'm just reading into this as always, but yeah, I liked it. I like the general paranoia and anxiety and loneliness. That, I think those are great elements in a horror story. Like Bodies and Joyce Carol Oates, she did that really well as well. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone familiar with Tanithly that this was good, because Tanithly is great. But yeah, Tanithly, I think that just about does it. Well, this is clearly like a Halloween themed episode. It's probably going to get posted well after it, considering the current date as I'm recording. But yeah, I really enjoyed dipping in and out of a few anthologies there. And I like especially these big boys, you know, like New Terrors and what's the other one? Dark Forces. It's nice to have these chunky ones that you can kind of dip in and out of, right? I don't think I'd want to read them cover to cover. It's nice for them to be a kind of like an object you can keep returning to, you know, keeps on giving. But yeah, good stories overall. I think, you know, let's just ignore the Patricia Highsmith stuff. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. And yeah, I mean, Ligotti, The Red Tower, love that. I'm really looking forward to reading more of his stuff and the rest of Teatro Grottesco, which I read the first third, and it's so good. So good. The Aickman story I loved. That's going to stay with me a long time. The View, really amazing. And another mostly short story writer that writes weird fiction that I just can't wait to read all of his stuff, you know. And I think there's so much to think about with each story. It feels like there's as much to think about in one story by either of those authors than an entire novel by any other author, you know. They're so like concentrated. I really like that. The Davis Grubb story was nice. That was quite a nice casual one. A bit on the lighter side, you know. The whole Appalachian vibe was great. I love that. It felt like verging on magical realism, you know, especially with the turning into catfish. If you're into magical realism, I think that's up your alley. In fact, I would just say that is a magical real story. And like, obviously, all of these terms can be argued, you know, like, was it Gene Wolfe said, magical realism is just fantasy written by South Americans, which I think is a really funny thing to say. And like, for all intents and purposes, it's true. But there's a feeling, right, to magical realism. It's almost like a tone. It's not necessarily like because people will say, oh, it's realism, but with fantasy kind of woven into it. And yeah, there's loads of stuff like that that isn't referred to as magical realism. Loads of low fantasy. Loads of horror is like that, which is basically low fantasy or dark fantasy or whatever. There's a particular kind of tone, which is a bit like the fairy tale, you know, that kind of magical feeling. Jesus Christ. This is turning into a right word salad, isn't it? You know what I mean? Or I hope you do, if you can make sense of that. But yeah, if you like magical realism, check out that Davis Grubb story, the Cresta 38. Pretty good. Yeah, Tanith Lee, you know, what can you say? I love Tanith Lee. I want to hunt down some more of her short stories. I got a few of her books, but I'm really interested in her short fiction. I feel like she's perfect for that, you know. And The Night Master was basically a short story collection that I thought was excellent, particularly if you like a kind of fictional mythology thing. It's not everyone's cup of tea, you know. It's light on character. It's more about the almost the logic of the tale itself, you know, like plot, but not in a crime way where it's very well worked out and everything. But it's like when you hear like a mythological tale of some ancient Greek god or whatever, the kind of logic behind that kind of story. I felt like she was exercising that in Night Master, which was really cool. And in like quite a dark and weird way, and funny at times. And there's like a cool part where it's like almost science fiction, where near the end, where the demon goes up to see the gods. They're like these cold machine-like beings that have no compassion for humanity. And just, yeah, Tanith Lee is fucking great. I hope you all have a nice Halloween, or had a nice Halloween. That's probably the better tense to use in terms of when this will be posted. See you later.